Okay, the third point on the evidence section of the rubric is for correctly sourcing 3 of the 7 documents. And I hate this point. You and everyone else, Baldy. This point is one of the most misunderstood points of the whole document-based question, I think because it actually requires some sophisticated thought and there's no formula to it. So if you don't get it right away, just keep practicing. You'll get it. Okay, let's get down to it. What does sourcing a document actually mean? Well, let's start as we always do with the College Board language. To source a document means a student explains the significance of the author's point of view, author's purpose, historical context, and/or audience for at least 3 documents. Okay, that's pretty clear, but in case you missed it, there are 4 methods for sourcing a document. You can source for historical context, audience, purpose, or point of view. And if you want an easy way to remember that, just think HAPP, HAP. For every document, you should be asking, what's happening? Haven't you used that joke before? Sorry. It's a good joke. Okay, let me tell you what each of those things means. I'm going to give you a brief summary first, and then we're going to go through each one of them in detail, and I'll give you some examples. Sourcing for historical context means that you have to understand the historical situation in which this document was produced in order to understand the document itself. To source for audience means that you explain how the document might be better understood if we only knew to whom it was written. To source for purpose means that you explain how this document can be better interpreted by explaining what it was meant to do in its audience. And to source for point of view essentially means to answer the following question. Why does he say what he says in the way that he says it? Or she, or it, whatever. And you have to do one of those 4 for at least 3 of the documents. Now, there isn't a formula here. You need to be familiar with all 4 of them and then be able to apply them with discernment. Not every sourcing technique is appropriate to every document. And that's a main problem I see in a lot of essays. A student will key in on one of the 4 sourcing methods, like purpose, and then just try to take every document and force it through the purpose sourcing grid. Well, the purpose of this document is this, and the purpose of that document is that. And it doesn't really make sense in that context to talk about your document's purpose because it doesn't really serve your argument. So the trick here, and this is what requires practice, is to be familiar with all 4 of these sourcing techniques and know which one is appropriate for which document. So let's look at each of them in detail and give some examples. In order to source a document for historical context, you need to answer the following question. How is the interpretation of this document affected by its larger historical situation? So let's read together the following document from the 2017 AP US History exam. Okay, this is document 4. It says it's coming from Quaker leaders, and they are giving an address to the Pennsylvania Colonial Assembly, January 1775. And it says this: Having considered with real sorrow the unhappy contest between the legislature of Great Britain and the people of these colonies, and the animosities consequent therein, we have by repeated public advices and private admonitions used our endeavors to dissuade the members of our religious society from joining with the public resolutions promoted and entered into by some of the people, which, as we apprehended, and so we now find, have increased contention, and produced great discord and confusion. We are therefore incited by a sincere concern for the peace and welfare of our country, publicly to declare against every usurpation of power and authority in opposition to the laws and government, and against all combinations, insurrections, conspiracies, and illegal assemblies. And as we are restrained from them by the conscientious discharge of our duty to Almighty God, by whom kings reign and princes decree justice, we hope to maintain the fidelity we owe to the king and his government as by law established, earnestly desiring the restoration of that harmony and concord which have heretofore united the people of these provinces. Okay, what does that document say? Well, it's basically Quakers talking to other Quakers to try to convince them not to join with all the rest of the colonists who are agitating for separation from Britain. And when I read this, I immediately want to go for historical context. What is the historical situation that makes sense out of why the Quakers would be saying this? First of all, who are the Quakers? Why would they be saying something like this? Well, I know they were pacifists, which means they were against all forms of violence. So that makes sense out of what they're saying in this document. And so if I wanted to source this for historical context, I would do it in the following way. After using my document to argue my point, I would then say, and this position is consistent with the larger concept of Quaker pacifism. Now, it's short, it's to the point, but it does give you the historical context as to why they would be saying what they're saying. However, what I'm about to read you will not get the sourcing point for historical context. The historical context of document 4 is the first shots at Lexington and Concord. Okay, now why doesn't that work? I mean, doesn't that sound like it should work? That's the historical context of the revolution and everything, but here's the problem. The Battle of Lexington and Concord happened after the Colonial Assembly mentioned here in Document 4, so it cannot have anything to do with the historical situation mentioned in this document. Okay, I hope that makes sense. Let's move on to audience. Okay, to source a document for its intended audience, you need to answer the following question. How does the interpretation of this document become clearer if I know to whom it is written? Okay, let's read another document from the 2017 AP US History exam, this time from Samuel Adams. Okay, as you can see, the source is Samuel Adams, and it's from something called The Rights of the Colonists, 1772. He says, all men have a right to remain in a state of nature as long as they please, and in case of intolerable oppression, civil or religious, to leave the society they belong to and enter into another. When men enter into society, it is by voluntary consent, and they have the right to demand and insist upon the performance of such conditions and previous limitations as a form of equitable original compact. All men have a right to remain in a state of nature as long as they please, and in case of intolerable oppression, civil or religious, to leave the society they belong to and enter into another. When men enter into society, it is by voluntary consent, and they have a right to demand and insist upon the performance of such conditions and previous limitations as form an equitable original compact. The natural liberty of man is to be free from any superior power on earth, and not to be under the will or legislative authority of man, but only to have the law of nature for his rule. Okay, the audience is significant in order to understand this. But remember, you can't just state who the intended audience is and leave it at that. You have to explain how the intended audience helps to interpret the document. For example, here's a student sample from this document who earned the point for intended audience. Adams desires to confirm the ideas of the colonists who are fed up with British rule, as well as advocate his desire to see American independence. And that's a complex way of just saying that Adams was writing to colonists who didn't like British rule anymore. Okay, so that's intended audience. Let's move on to purpose. To source a document for purpose, you need to ask the following question. What was this document intended to do in its audience? Now, here's what I found as I've read essays at the national exam. If somebody is weak in sourcing, 9 times out of 10, they're going to go for purpose. And in my experience, 9 times out of 10, they're doing it wrong. Okay, let me try to show you what I mean. Let's go back to the document from the AP World History exam from 2017, the one about Buddhists and merchants. So if I want to source this document for purpose, then I need to ask, what is this document intended to do in its audience? And here's an answer that got credit. This picture, document 6, is directed toward other people who are Buddhists, and it shows them how they should act. It's telling them that in order to be like the Buddha, you must give to people and be kind. Religious groups in these documents tell their audiences that wealth accumulation is wrong and unholy, but that they can reject desire or greed by giving generously to the church or others in need. Now notice in this explanation, this particular student showed what this painting was intended to do in its audience. It was supposed to show them how to act, and then the student goes on to explain what that new way of acting was. Now let me give you one more piece of advice here. Where a lot of people get purpose wrong is that they tend to substitute purpose for the interpretation of the document. For example, in that document we just looked at, if you say, this document's purpose is to show that the religious people are higher than the merchants. Okay, yes, that's true, but that's just the interpretation of the document. That's not its purpose. Remember, in order to source for purpose, you need to ask, what was this document intended to do in its audience? Okay, that's purpose. Let's move on finally to point of view. Okay, sourcing for point of view can be very confusing. You see, in English class, point of view indicates who is telling the story. Is it first person, second person, or third person? Historical point of view has nothing to do with that. To source for point of view, you need to ask the following question. Why is he saying what he's saying in the way that he's saying it? Or why is she saying what she's saying in the way that she's saying it? You get it. Now, the special sauce of that question is in that phrase, in the way he's saying it. For example, if my friend sits across the table from me and asks, hey, you want to be a vegan with me? And I say, oh, I'd love to be a vegan. In fact, I can't think of anything I'd love more than being a vegan. The real interpretation of that statement is not what I'm saying, It's in the way that I'm saying it. So if I were to source that little conversation for point of view, it might go something like this. While Heimler's words themselves show eager acceptance of veganism, his sarcastic tone and scoffing facial gestures suggest that he in fact does not want to be a vegan. Alright, let me give you an example of this from the 2017 AP European History exam. Okay, the source here is Gilbert Burnett, an Anglican bishop and close friend of William III, from a sermon preached at the coronation ceremony of William III, April 1689, and he says this: "When the encouraging and promoting of a vigorous piety and sublime virtue and the explaining and propagating of true religion is a chief design of their rule, when impiety and vice are punished, and error is repressed, when the decency of the worship of God is kept up without adulterating it with superstitions, when order is carried on in the church of God without tyranny, and above all, when princes are in their own deportment examples of the fear of God, and when it is visible that they honor those who fear the Lord, and that vile men are despised by them, then do they truly rule in fear of God." And here's an example of a student who got the point of view sourcing correct. Burnett may have wanted William to look good since they were friends, and as an Anglican priest, he had to support Protestantism. Now, the reason why he got this correct is because he explained why Burnett said what he said in the way that he said it. He explains Burnett's rationale for both speaking well of William III and of Protestantism. That's point of view. And so that's it for sourcing. You only have to do one of those four for at least 3 of the documents, and of course I would suggest you do 4, because if you get one wrong, you can still get the point for 3. Is that unnecessarily complicated? Rewind it back, I think it makes sense. So for at least 3 of the documents, ask yourself which of the 4 sourcing techniques would most aptly apply to that particular document, and explain it in a couple of sentences at most, and then move on. And that's it for the evidence section. I'll see you in Outside Evidence.